You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around? Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning. Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. My name's Joseph Toscano. Now, if you're expecting a funny program, well, move on. Not many funny things are happening at the minute. Now, if you wonder what anarchy is all about, anarchos without rulers. It's about creating a society without rulers, not rules. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people, as we see today? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle was the struggle to devolve or share power, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Exceptionally conservative networks. Nothing radical about that. And now, George Orwell, has been claimed by many people, but George Orwell did make an important statement. That telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And what today we're going to do, or try to do, is tell the truth. Because telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And that's the purpose of the Anarchist World this week. Obviously, let's be realistic. The influence we have is minimal in this society. Almost infinitesimal, if you look at this clearly. But the important thing is we do have some type of influence. And telling the truth is not just a revolutionary act. It is a necessary act in a period of misinformation, disinformation, whatever you like to call it. Now, we live in a so-called liberal parliamentary democracy, a liberal state that upholds the right of people to protest, the right of people to speak their minds. So why is it that mass murderers, child killers, and war criminals are fated in this country? Not only fated, but totally supported. I'll say it again. Telling the truth is a revolutionary act. So why is it that mass murderers, child killers and war criminals are fated in Australia in 2024? A so-called social democracy, So let's look at the facts. Look, I'm not taking sides. I'm not interested in taking sides. What's going on in the Middle East? What I'm interested in is looking at the facts. Because unfortunately, The corporate-owned media and the government-gelded ABC seem to be nothing more than Israeli Defence Forces apologists. Just extraordinary how things are portrayed in the legacy media in this country. Just extraordinary. As well as the garbage we see on asocial media. But I keep asking myself, how do mass murderers, child killers and war criminals are not only supported but feted in this country? Let's look at the facts. Over 70 years ago, Palestinians were forced at the end of a gun from their lands and the State of Israel was created. Now again, I am not taking sides. I just want to look at the facts and I want to understand how, as a society, we support mass murderers, child killers and war criminals. Total support. All right? Now, obviously, the Palestinian people found themselves in a difficult situation. They found themselves as internal refugees in their own country. Fact. Then we had the 1967 war, where the State of Israel was able to expand its sovereign, landmass, whatever you'd like to call it. And we found that the Palestinians were driven out of East Jerusalem, driven into the Gaza Strip, the world's biggest prison, and kind of penned in the West Bank, Over the next 40 to 50 years, we saw increasing pressure placed on Palestinians as more and more of the land they inhabited for 2,000 years disappeared as all these illegal settlements were created. And then in 2016, when Hamas was elected as the government of Gaza and they broke away from the Fatah, what we saw is that Gaza became the world's biggest prison. Over 2.5 million people were basically incarcerated in this area. Now, almost a year ago, on the 7th of October, after 8 years of imprisonment, Hamas broke out of Gaza and killed over 1,200 over 1,200 Israeli citizens within a day or two. Now, obviously, the Israeli state, which prides itself on its ability to protect its citizens, was found to be totally wanting on that day. How could a military force, which is described as one of the most sophisticated military forces on the planet, not be aware of a mass breakout from Gaza? And obviously the ensuing carnage which was reaped on Israeli citizens had a profound impact on the government of the day. Fact. Another little fact. Over 42,000, yes, 42,000 Palestinians have died in the Gaza Strip, which is an area about a third the size of Melbourne, in the last year. The Gaza has been reduced to rubble. People are living a hand-to-mouth existence, and of those 42,000, over almost 12,000 are children. Okay? Could you imagine the outcry if 12,000 Israeli or Australian children were killed in this indiscriminate type of warfare. Then we have the criminal court in The Hague designating the Prime Minister of Israel and the Defence Minister as war criminals, although warrants haven't been issued for their arrest at this particular point in time. Okay? Now, obviously, during this time, we've seen the Liberal National Coalition throw in their total support for the Israeli government, which has been responsible for mass murder, which includes the killing of children, and that it's been designated, its leadership has been designated as war criminals. Okay? These are facts. At the same time, in the last few days, we've seen over 1 million people living in southern Lebanon being displaced from their homes in a campaign which has been initiated by the Israeli state because they're concerned about the 60,000 Israeli citizens who've been forced from their homes because of the activities of Hezbollah, which is a proscribed organisation in this country, although Hezbollah represents the interests of millions of Shia Muslims in southern Lebanon. Okay? And this has led to over 1,000 deaths, which again includes children. It doesn't matter how good your bombing is. So on the one hand, we have 2.5 million Palestinians who've been driven from their homes, mainly in the Gaza Strip in the last year. Over 1 million Lebanese have been driven out of South Lebanon in the last 2 to 3 weeks. And we've seen 60,000 Israelis driven out of northern Israel. So how do you, or me, or all of us, how do we put this together? We've got a government that is willing to drive out 1 million Lebanese from their homes in order that 60,000 Israelis may return to their homes. At the same time, we have in this country political leaders on both sides at the state and Commonwealth level, as well as the legacy media in all its formats, almost having a fit because a few people flew a Hezbollah flag at a pro-Palestinian rally. I mean, this is the big issue in Australia. This is the big issue. Huge issue. They should be deported. They should be imprisoned. My God, what have these people done? They're holding up the picture of a man who was the leader of Hezbollah, who was assassinated a week ago. They're flying a Hezbollah flag. Well, what about the 42,000 Palestinians that have died in the last year? We do speak about the 1,200 Israelis who died, and we do speak about, well, we don't seem to speak about the hostages anymore. It's as if their government has completely disowned them. It's more interested in getting 60,000 Israelis back into their homes, and they could do that tomorrow, not through a bombing campaign, which has displaced over 1 million Lebanese, but they could do that by having a ceasefire in Gaza. So what's this all about? Now, over the last 24 hours, we've seen Iran send over some rockets into Israel. And I think for the first time, the Israeli population is beginning to understand what their government is doing, and that there is no way that this type of tit-for-tat, situation is going to do anything for anybody in Gaza or southern Lebanon or Israel or Iran. And at the same time, we've seen how important the United States of America is to the Israeli state, because the current strategy of Mr. Netanyahu is very simple. And his cabinet is exceptionally simple. They need the United States of America to use their superior firepower to assist them to continue their mass murder. And we've seen now the United States military been involved in a variety of ways, as well as having increased aircraft carriers in the area, tens of thousands of US troops, advisors within the Israeli Defence Forces, and the never-ending supply of weapons and intelligence to the Israeli Defence Forces. As if somehow this increasing level of violence is going to somehow create security for Israeli citizens. And that's the key, isn't it? It's about security for Palestinians, for Israelis. And I think people need to understand there are facts which you just cannot hide away by carrying on about a rally which may be banned in Sydney because the New South Wales police think it may pose a threat to order, as if there aren't enough New South Wales police to maintain order at a demonstration. So what we are seeing is this selective reporting of what can only be described as atrocities. Selective reporting of atrocities to ensure the Australian people are not aware of what's going on. I mean, self-censorship. The fact that we hear one side of the story ad nauseum. The fact that the death of 42,000 people in Gaza is almost irrelevant, and the death of 12,000 children doesn't really matter. And all that matters is that 60,000 Israelis can't return to their homes. I mean, what's happening in the Middle East currently highlights the total hypocrisy of this country. Why is it acceptable for us as a people to accept mass murder and child killers and war criminals? Not only accept them, but fate them as heroes. I'm sure that if Hezbollah or Hamas was doing the same thing in Israel, it'll be a totally different story. But the strategy of Netanyahu is very simple. He needs United States support. And to gain United States military support, direct military intervention, not indirect military intervention with military advisors and weapons, but direct military intervention, he needs to create the situation that will expand this war. He knows that his little country, irrespective of the bombastic rhetoric, will never be able to obtain security without total support from the United States of America, including military support. It's quite ironic that on the cusp of an election in the United States of America and in Australia in a few months' time, we see such little emphasis placed on the truth. Extraordinary. But you've got to remember, this is a country that has lived on lies, continues to live on lies. First Nations people didn't exist. They never offered any resistance. This was the land of terra nullius till 1992 legally, the land of no one. This is the land where people became rich by dispossessing the original inhabitants, killing them, dispersing them, interning them. This is a country which set up the White Australia policy in 1901 as the first piece of legislation to go through Parliament, and there was only one parliamentarian that opposed the White Australia policy. And we see it over and over again. We saw it with the referendum on a voice to Parliament. We see it constantly. We see it in the report on the ABC. The fact that racism is endemic in the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. If it's endemic in the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, what's it like in the rest of the community? But more importantly, what's it like in the corporate-owned media? So, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. But there is a high cost if people speak out. At least in a dictatorship, you know that if you speak out, you're going to disappear or end up in a gulag. But the high cost in this country is a little bit different. It's about not being able to find work. It's about being spied on. It's about being marginalised. It's about being ostracised. It's about not having the ability to get your ideas across. Now, obviously, I'm speaking on community radio, and this program is broadcast via the Community Radio Network to a number of community radio stations in this country. But people like me and you'll never see on the corporate-owned media, occasionally on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I mean, we live in a society where white is black and black is white, where we can accept the worst atrocities, mass murder, child killing, war criminals in our midst, accept this, not only today, but accept it in terms of our history, accept it in terms of not actually being able to, somehow support a voice to Parliament. It's an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in 2024. Now, as Netanyahu and his cabinet increase their aggressive stance towards their neighbours who are sovereign nation states, we will see them play a game trying to pull the United States of America into a military conflict in the Middle East. Now, obviously, military conflicts in the Middle East are now, or anywhere, it's all about technology, planes, bombs, drones. It's very easy to kill people when you press a button. But ultimately, all those involved on both sides will pay a high cost in terms of their own mental stability. Because if there's one thing we have learnt from war, is what happens to those people who are involved in war, who are fighting on our behalf. Look at the fate of so many Vietnam veterans and the issues that they have when they return, which are passed on to their families. It's an extraordinary situation where in the 21st century, almost at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, we are still fighting each other for country, God, rulers, whatever. What an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in 2024. As I said, I'm not taking sides. Many people take sides. You know, they wave their flags. But what I'm seeing is how what is happening in the Middle East and what has happened in this country in the past highlights the total hypocrisy of the people we appoint or elect to govern us. When New South Wales Police have the audacity to take some rally to mark the year of the mass slaughter in Gaza to the Supreme Court of New South Wales, so they can get the march banned and a candlelight procession banned, you can understand the situation we are finding ourselves in this country. I mean, when the Israeli forces entered a sovereign nation state, Lebanon, they assassinated people. They killed civilians. Did we have a hullabaloo? Did we have any of our major political leaders come out and say, well, this isn't really acceptable, it's not acceptable? No. This is a country whose political leaders fate mass murderers, child killers and war criminals. You listen to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Now, I'd just like to remind people that the 9th of October is Peter Norman Day. And you're thinking to yourself, who's Peter Norman? What's Peter Norman Day? What's it got to do with me? Well, it's a very simple concept. In 1968 at the Mexico Olympics, 3 runners in the 200 metres campaign came first, second and third. There was Tommy Smith got a gold, Peter Norman, an Australian who nobody expected to get a medal, got a silver in a record time, and John Carlos, another United States athlete, got a bronze. Now, in 1968, because of what was happening in the United States of America, the land of the brave and the free, unless you're black or, you're tainted with the brush, there was a movement to boycott the Mexico Olympics. But the United States Track and Field Association came to an agreement that they would conduct a campaign for universal human rights. And that's the key, universal human rights. And an association was formed among players, participants or competitors, the United States team. And when it came to the presentation of the medals, Tommy Smith and John Carlos asked Peter Norman, did he believe in God? And as an old Salvation Army lad, he said yes. And then they asked him, do you believe in universal human rights? And he said yes. Now, this is a very, very radical thing to say in 1968. And when they did the Universal Human Rights Salute, which has been mistakenly called the Black Power Salute, at the Mexico Olympics, and if you don't believe me, look at the original accounts from Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and Tommy Smith is still alive, and he addressed the Paris Olympics, where he congratulated Peter Norman's support for universal human rights. And the price, as I keep saying, I was speaking out. Now, Peter Norman on the dais wore a badge for universal human rights, which had been given to him by Mr. Hoffman, a rower, United States rower. He bowed his head as Tommy Smith and John Carlos saluted for universal human rights. As I said before, there's always a high cost of speaking out, and obviously Peter Norman paid that price. But what is important about Peter Norman is not the fact that he won silver in a record time, which I still think stands in Australia of 20.1 seconds, but the fact that he found himself in a situation where he was asked to support what at that time was a very unpopular act. And he said to Tommy Smith and John Carlos, I will stand with you. Now, irrespective of any shortcomings Peter Norman had, and I'm sure he had shortcomings like you and me, we're all human, the fact is that Tommy Smith and John Carlos came to his funeral in Coburg, in Melbourne, in 2006 to act as pallbearers because they had so much respect for him. And that respect is not just about an individual doing something at a moment, historic moment. It's much more than that. It's about that each and every one of us has the capacity to be Peter Norman. Every day we are faced with what are totally unacceptable situations. And every day we look at our telephones and we walk away because there is a price to standing up, and Peter Norman paid that price. But the fact is we all have the potential on any given day to be Peter Norman. Although we may endanger our safety, our career, our reputation. And Peter Norman Day was designated, the day of his funeral, the 9th of October, was designated by the by the United States Track and Field Association, not the Australian Track and Field Association, to honour that moment. Not just the man, but the moment where somebody who really had very little to do with their struggle made the decision to stand up and support that struggle. And that's what Peter Norman Day is about. Now, you'll find that across this country, Peter Norman Day doesn't exist. Forgotten. Pushed to the side. What is it? 56 years since that moment. But here in Melbourne, every year we have a small gathering of people who respect that. And fortunately, since 2018, there's been a statue erected to Peter Norman outside Lakeside Oval, which is Victoria's premier athletics track here in Melbourne. So the 9th of October, which is next week at midday, a few of us will be gathering outside the gates of the Lakeside Oval next to the Peter Norman statue to remember that moment. Not just to pay our respects to Mr. Norman, who died, 16 years ago, 18 years ago, but to pay our respects to that lesson we can learn from what happened on that day. So I invite you, if you don't live in Melbourne, don't worry, you can organise a Peter Norman Day. It doesn't take much to set a time, a little bit of publicity, and gather to mark that moment. You can go to the Peter Norman Facebook page, tons of information about Peter Norman. You can have a little gathering somewhere. And once again, I'll mention, there is an interesting monument to that moment in the United States of America. There's a bronze statue of Tommy Smith, a bronze statue of John Carlos, and in the middle where Peter Norman should be, there is nothing, just a dais. And that is just about to highlight the central crux of this remembrance. You can be Peter Norman, whether you're fat or thin, tall or short, pink or yellow, male or female, non-binary, doesn't matter. You have the capacity to stand up to support other people who are, for a variety of reasons, discriminated. Whether it's about their sexual orientation, their gender, their racial identity, their religion, the language they speak, and the list goes on and on. That's what Peter Norman Day is about. And I encourage you, to those of you who are listening to this program across the country, I encourage you to organise a Peter Norman commemoration in your part of the world. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. A few websites, anarchistmedia.org, Public Interest Before Corporate Interests, YouTube channels, Public Interest Before Corporate Interests, josephtoscano.nam. You've got, you can write to us. Yes, we still take letters. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489. Listen to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. You're listening to this program. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. There are hundreds of podcasts you can access. You can go to 3cr.org.au. All right, let's move on. The cost of living crisis. You love it. The cost of living crisis. The Liberal National Coalition hopes to be able to, this is the robo-debt people, hopes to be able to sail into power next year on a cost of living crisis election. Extraordinary. Cost of living crisis election. Does anybody ever ask themselves, do we see anything about who profits from the cost of living crisis? Who profits? Because there is a silver lining. Because there are a lot of people making a lot of money from the cost of living crisis. Because to a significant degree, this is a manufactured crisis. Interest rates go up. Who suffers? People paying rent. People paying a mortgage. Only 1/3 of Australians own their own home outright. That means 2/3 have an issue. When prices go up on essential commodities, irrespective of how sneaky our major, food distribution networks are, when prices go up, do you think people who earn lots of money kind of suffer? No. Have we seen anything in the last 3 to 4 years during the cost of living crisis which has seen a downturn in profitability for this country's major corporations? No. A few have gone to the wall, but that's pretty normal. So who profits? Who profits from a cost of living crisis? Who makes a buck? Who suffers? But the dilemma is that if you are at the bottom end of the economic scale, you pay the highest price. And if you're at the top end of the economic scale, the price you pay is minimal. You actually make a buck out of it. It was like COVID-19. Who made a buck? The major corporations. So what we should be looking at is why we've got a cost of living crisis, but more importantly, who profits from the so-called cost of living crisis. It's a little bit like the goods and services tax. If you're a business, you claim most of that back in your taxation, when you do your tax. But when you've got to pay 10% on essential commodities and you're one-third of Australians on social security benefits, or the 90% of Australians who aren't part of the property market or the share market outside your superannuation, well, it's difficult. It gets more difficult. It's just like the cost of living crisis. If gas, electricity goes up, those at the lower end, economic lower end, have a crisis. Those who are economically, independent, no crisis. Now, when you see the opposition trying to manipulate this situation, this is the robo-debt crowd, don't forget they're the robo-debt crowd, trying to manipulate the situation and saying that if we get into power, we are going to address the cost of living crisis. So how are they going to address the cost of living crisis? Well, they're going to do more deregulation. They're going to outlaw what's left of the trade union movement. Right? And they're going to reintroduce, the leaner and lifters, business. There are leaners and lifters, and obviously the leaners are those on social security benefits and low incomes, and the lifters are those who are, entrepreneurial and make a buck. So don't get sucked in by the rhetoric that somehow the cost of living crisis is going to be resolved by government getting out of the way of business and corporations, because the cost of living crisis to a significant degree is due to the fact that government has got out of the way of businesses and corporations, and the ultimate endpoint of capitalism, a private investment for private profit mantra, is the fact that what you get is corporations dominating essential aspects of everyday life. We see it everywhere. I know the opposition loves to think of small business as their great supporters and the engine room of the country. Well, unfortunately, the number of people employed in small business is dropping dramatically. All you've got to do is walk into a metropolis of consumption called a shopping centre, or go onto Amazon's website, those wonderful people, and you can see how small business has been regulated, pushed out of business through the ascendancy of corporations. So the thing is, we are not going to get out of a cost of living crisis until we determine our own destiny. To allow our natural resources which belong to First Nations people and the rest of us, to allow them to be exploited by a handful of corporations for some pitiful royalties and the occasional piece of, taxation which falls into the Treasury is pathetic. I know this is boring, I've told you, I've mentioned it every week. 26 million people living on a continent. Come on, a resource-rich continent. This isn't Lebanon in the midst of a crisis. It's not Myanmar in the midst of a civil war. It's not Sudan in the midst of a war. This is Australia. And we have private charities raising money to send Australian kids to public schools. We don't have enough money to fully support public schools. Well, we've got tons of money to support private schools. That's public money to support private schools. We don't have enough money to have a decent public health system. The list goes on. And you ask yourself why. Well, governments rely on taxation revenue. In the past, they relied on taxation revenue and publicly owned companies, which in the majority of cases actually made a profit before they were privatised, and now the private sector makes a profit. So until we become masters of our own destiny by nationalising our resources and using the profits that come from those resources for the common good, things are not going to change. We don't even have to nationalise them. We just need a taxation policy which ensures that the bulk of profits don't go to the major shareholders of privately owned companies, but go to the Australian people through some type of future fund. We got a future fund, but it's hardly got any money in it when you look at the situation we find ourselves in. But to a significant degree, it's our fault, It's our fault because we've allowed this to develop. We've believed in the trickle-down economic theory. It should be called a treacle, T-R-E-A-C-E-L-E economic theory. Trickle-down, not trickle-down, trickle-down. So, who profits? Who makes a buck? Why do we find ourselves in the same situation? Currently, obviously, news is dominated by what's happening overseas, but that doesn't change what's happening here. We see more deregulation, more privatisation, more globalisation, more corporatisation. And governments seem totally ineffective. We have one group, the government in waiting, His Majesty's, my apologies, Queen Lizzie's dead, I forgot, His Majesty's loyal opposition, the fruits of her loins, Mr Dutton-led Liberal National Party, telling us it'll all be hunky-dory if we continue our pro-corporate network. And the other side, we've got this party which is totally hamstrung by the inability to break out of the cocoon they find themselves in. Unlike the Whitlam-led Labor government between 1970 and 1974, which passed more progressive legislation in 4 years than has been passed since Federation in 1901, they are so concerned about how the corporate-owned media dominates discussion in this country that they tread softly. And sometimes treading softly gets you nowhere. Sometimes you need to take the fist out of the velvet glove to get somewhere. I mean, that's the history of lesson. That's the lesson of history, not the history of lesson. You love that? That's the lesson of history. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is transmitted across Australia by the Community Radio Network. It's coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The housing crisis. We see we've got a cost of living crisis and we've got a housing crisis, all right? We can blame migration, we can blame lack of skills, we can blame lack of a workforce, but the fact is, decisions have been made. Decisions have been made by governments at the state level, mainly at the state level, and to a lesser degree at the federal level, that the housing crisis can only be solved by giving the private sector its head. That the way you produce more homes, build more homes, I should say, not produce, but build more homes, is by allowing the private sector to dominate the housing market. Now, ultimately, in a social democracy or a parliamentary democracy, although they're a little bit different, both of them, but in a parliamentary democracy, if you have no competition and you leave everything in the hands of the private sector, you get escalating prices. It's simple mathematics. Even an idiot like me knows that, all right? So what I found fascinating about the housing crisis is no mention of the P word. You know, the public word. P, public. The greatest good for the greatest number. That's what public is about. The greatest good for the greatest number. I mean, I'm actually the registered officer of public interest before corporate interests. Right? And when we first formed this organisation in 2015, we were gobsmacked by the fact that so few Australians understood the concept of public. To them, because of the denigration of the concept of having an organisation or an economic system or a government which puts the interest of the greatest good for the greatest number, I mean, to them, public was inefficient, second rate, not worth the effort. And the fact is, they're right, because there's not enough funding for the public sector, and with the privatisation of the public sector, where public enterprise, which are profitable, have been given away. I mean, the classic is when Mr. Keating, privatised CSIRO. You could buy a share, I think, for about $2.95. Today, be lucky, not CSIRO, CSL, my apologies, the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory. Two different things. The Commonwealth Serum Laboratory was established by the Hughes-led Labor government in 1914 to provide vaccinations for Australian people, right? Now, when the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory was privatised in the mid-90s, it became a gangbuster for the private sector. Today, if you want to buy a share for the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, you're looking at about between $2.90 and $3.20, and they were sold off at $2.95. And we see it in many other aspects of this country. So I'll go through this again. I know it's tedious, but, politics, social change, radical change, reform is a tedious process. It can take years for change to occur. It's very simple. The housing market is in the hands of the private sector. When it's in the hands of the private sector, there is no competition. Prices escalate. The best way to resolve the housing crisis is not by digging more holes, as the Victorian government is doing, spending $250 billion, $250 billion, digging a hole. That money could have been spent on public housing. But we don't have public housing. We have private housing. We wrap it up, as I said before. I mean, when, we say mass murderers, child killers, war criminals, we fate them as heroes. Not it's the same thing, but it's a similar philosophy, Similar philosophy. You remove the public element from the housing market, and there are extraordinary profits to be made. Now, if you are interested in the idea of public housing, because, see, the more public housing you have, the less need for private housing. The less need for private housing, what happens is investors leave the private housing market. The more investors leave, a drop in housing prices. People can actually, first-home buyers can buy at the lower end. It's a very simple concept. I don't understand why all these intelligent people that advise governments never mention the P word, public, the greatest good for the greatest number. You've been listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program has been coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. My name is Joseph Toscano. I've been hosting today's program. If you want to look at a few things, YouTube, public interest before corporate interest. You can join public interest before corporate interest today. Go to their website, pibci.net, pibci.net. You can join online. Doesn't cost anything. Why don't you put a political struggle for the the greatest good for the greatest number is at the forefront of the way you wish to act. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Don't forget the Eureka celebrations in Ballarat on Tuesday, the 3rd of December. I'll be talking about that later on. And most importantly of all, don't forget to come along to the Peter Norman Day on Wednesday the 9th. If you can't come, organise your own festival. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
.3CR is about community, and we welcome your participation at the station.
3CR is open to a wide diversity of volunteers and is a great way to connect with Melbourne's activist community.
Have you ever thought about volunteering, doing a reception shift, getting a program on air?
Training in radio skills or contributing to one of the station's committees.
There are many ways to be involved at 3CR.
To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au and get in touch.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.